Has everybody had a chance to look at a copy of the presentment? You all have copies? All right. Thank you all for being here. This is the DAO's regular Monday morning press conference. And as we do every week, we address two things. One is a summary of information about gun violence during the prior week, and the second is an important topic of some kind. Today, the topic has to do with the killing of 12-year-old Thomas TJ Siderio, a police-involved shooting in which Officer Ed Saul Mendoza has now been charged with first-degree murder, third-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and other charges in connection with the killing of this 12-year-old. We have made available copies of the presentment in this matter. A presentment, of course, is the finding of a grand jury. They are secret until they are not. And this presentment is no longer secret, as you will see from the order signed by a supervising judge, which permits us to make it publicly available. Ed Saul Mendoza, as we appear today, is in custody. He is held without bail. His bail hearing occurred at this point about 2.5 hours ago. And that is a normal bail for someone who's charged with first-degree murder. I want to acknowledge some of the community stakeholder staff who are here. We have First Assistant Robert Listenby. We have First Assistant Carolyn Engel-Temmen. ADA Brian Collins is here, who has taken a primary role in relation to the investigation and the charging of Ed Saul Mendoza. We have ADA Joanne Pescator, who's the supervisor of our DA's office Homicide and Non-Fatal Shootings Unit. We have with us Reverend Myra Maxwell, the executive director of our DAO Victim Support Services Division, and Melanie Nelson, who's the executive director of our DAO Crisis Assistance Response and Engagement Cares Unit. Summary in relation to gun violence during the prior week, and this is in general, most of this data is from 4/22 through 4/28, the usual time period, although the homicide number is up to date. We are at 157 homicides year to date. On this date last year, there were 173. That is 16 fewer. And it represents a decrease of about 9%, maybe a little closer to 10% over last year. Obviously, none of that is good news because it still reflects that there were 5 homicides last week and there were 29 non-fatal shootings during this terrible gun violence crisis. But that 5 homicides should be placed in context, and the context is that during the pandemic, we've seen an average of about 1.5 homicides per day. That works out to about 10.5 homicides per week ordinarily. This number is 5. During the same period, there were 148 gun-related incidents. Among those incidents, and that includes both gun violence in which there are shootings, but it also, or gunpoint robberies, but it also includes gun possession. Among those 148 incidents, 69 arrests were made and 68 cases were opened and charged by the DA's office. I'm going to highlight briefly 3 gun violence incidents. The first, a homicide; the second, a non-fatal shooting; and the third, a non-fatal triple shooting. In the first incident, this occurred on Sunday, May the 1st at about 6:42 p.m. in the 6100 block of Baynton, B-A-Y-N-T-O-N Street in the 14th District. A 31-year-old black male was shot multiple times. He was transported to Einstein, where he was pronounced a short time later. No arrest has been made. This is an active investigation. Anyone with information, please contact PPD's Shooting Investigation Group at 215-686-8255. 8270. Second incident is also a non-fatal, is a non-fatal, I beg your pardon, the prior was a homicide. And this occurred on Sunday, May the 1st at about 9:27 p.m. on West Weaver Street, also in the 14th District. An approximately 28-year-old black male was shot 5 times. He was transported to Einstein and placed in stable condition. Once again, anyone with information, please contact PPD Shooting Investigation Group at 215-686-8270. The third of these matters is a triple shooting that occurred on Sunday, May the 1st at about 9:39 p.m. in the 2700 block of North 29th Street in the 39th District. Victim number 1 is a 54-year-old black male shot 3 times in the left arm, in stable condition. Victim number 2, a 49-year-old black male shot multiple times in the right side of his body. And victim number 3, a 31-year-old black male shot once in the right ankle, transported to Presbyterian in stable condition. This is an ongoing investigation. Anyone with information, please contact PPD Shooting Investigation Group at 215-686-8270. It is now my pleasure to introduce people who just never stop working for victims and for the families of people who have suffered a homicide. And that is Myra Maxwell and Melanie Nelson. I'm going to ask them to come forward to provide some information on the services that were provided during last week to support victims, co-victims, and survivors.
Good morning. The CARES unit responded to 4 families last week, providing 12 services to them. I would like to thank all of those who traveled with the Victim Services Division to Harrisburg with the CARES unit for National Victims' Rights Week. Thank you so much for your support.
And we'd also like to thank all of those who have attended last week the Philadelphia Coalition for Victim Advocacy's annual candle lighting ceremony. We also want to congratulate all of the victim advocates who received awards for their exemplary services to crime victims, witnesses, co-victims, and survivors throughout that week. Thank you all for your support and your service.
Thank you, Melanie, Myra, for everything you do. At this time, we're going to shift our topic to really a tragic situation. And that is to update you all on recent developments in relation to the police-involved shooting of 12-year-old Thomas TJ Siderio. I know you all have a copy of the presentment. I'm going to anticipate a couple questions and try to summarize what we see as the highlights. First of all, for those of you who've had a chance to read it, there are references to a video in there. You have not seen that video. There is video that has been published and has been viewed by media, but you have not seen the video that was presented to a grand jury in this matter, which forms the basis for many of its findings. Those findings can be summarized as follows. Police officer Ed Saul Mendoza shot and killed, unarmed, 12-year-old Thomas Siderio. Thomas Siderio had likely fired a Taurus 9mm into the unmarked police vehicle where Officer Mendoza and others were driving as it was pulling up to Siderio and a juvenile, 17-year-old juvenile named NK, that's how we designate him. When the child fired the gun, that immediately caused 3 officers to take cover, and police officer Mendoza began what can be fairly called a tactically unsound foot chase of the 12-year-old. Directly after one of the officers, P.O. Sarpong, took cover, he fired once at no target in particular. P.O. Mendoza fired 3 times, once at the beginning of the block near 18th and Barber Streets where the foot chase began, once in the middle of the 1700 Barber Street block. And once at the end of the block, while standing on the sidewalk and relatively close to Thomas Siderio. At the time of the last two shots, Thomas Siderio was unarmed, having discarded the gun back at 1739 Barber Street, which was approximately 40 feet away from where Thomas Siderio was chased and then shot. Those 40 feet constituted a few parked cars and a few empty parking spaces. 40 feet is a long way. It is certain that Thomas Siderio, at the time he was shot, had stopped running and that he was possibly surrendering. It is certain that Thomas Siderio, at the time he was shot, was essentially face down on the sidewalk, that he was in a position that approximates sort of a push-up, turning back towards where the officer was pursuing him, perhaps turning to look at the officer who was pursuing him when he was shot through the back. Police Officer Mendoza's second shot, as corroborated by video, audio, and crime scene maps, was fired while the officer was running mid-block on Barber Street past the car where the Taurus was located and secured by Officer Camacho. That second shot did not hit Thomas Siderio, but nearly simultaneous with the shot, Thomas Siderio stopped running and went to the ground, either because he fell or because he was diving onto the ground. Police Officer Mendoza then slowed down and changed direction in a way that shows that he knew that Thomas Siderio had stopped and where he was located. Police Officer Mendoza's approach to Siderio was completely inconsistent with Mendoza believing Siderio was armed. Officer Mendoza approached Siderio even though Siderio was behind a parked car where the child could have been taking advantage of cover. Officer Mendoza's approach also required Mendoza to pass through an opening between two parked cars, which would have placed him into a suspect's potential line of fire if Mendoza had believed there was a weapon. Nevertheless, Mendoza went right through there. Mendoza did not hesitate even a moment to enter what some experts call this fatal funnel, in other words, a constrained space where the arrival of police officers is predictable. When Mendoza fired the third shot, he was within half a car length of Thomas Siderio, and thus would have had the opportunity to see Thomas Siderio clearly at the time he fired. Finally, P.O. Mendoza told Police Officer Camacho, who arrived right after the shooting, Mendoza told Camacho immediately after the shooting that Thomas Siderio threw the gun around there, the gun around there, and pointed to the location of the gun. Camacho then immediately went to the place that Mendoza had indicated and secured the gun. The gun was sitting on the street below the curb line, nearly 40 feet away. Thus, when Officer Mendoza fired the third and fatal shot, he knew the 12-year-old, 5-foot-tall, 111-pound Thomas Siderio no longer had a gun and no ability to harm him. But he fired a shot through his back, nonetheless, that killed him. Based on the evidence that we have obtained and considered, which establishes a prima facie case, the grand jury, found the following charges: murder of the first degree, murder of the third degree, voluntary manslaughter, possession of an instrument of crime. Are there any questions?
It reads like an assassination. Do you believe that this reads in some way like an assassination, a cop assassinating a 12-year-old?
Mr. Cole, and I say this with great respect, I'm going to take the other question first in a sense of fairness to all, and then we will get to your question shortly. Yes, please.
You said that Officer Mendoza was within at least a half car length of TJ. Was he, standing over him when he shot him? Was he standing over this 12-year-old?
I'm going to let ADA Collins. I mean, I can answer that, but I think ADA Collins, who has been the most into the details of this matter, may be able to articulate this with specificity that's useful to you. ADA Collins?
So based on the evidence that we reviewed, it looks like Mendoza is standing and the 12-year-old is on the ground.
Did
When-
he like stop and then shoot him, or was he like running?
Yes. For that, I'd rather refer to what's actually in the video.
Do you guys think you'll release the video before trial?
You want to answer that? Yeah, the DA will answer.
This has been a grand jury investigation, as I'm sure you're aware. All sorts of secrecy applies to such thing. It has also been an ongoing investigation. It is still an ongoing investigation. So we are being extremely careful not to go beyond what we are permitted by the court to reveal. There may very well come a time when we are able to show that video, but we are not going to do that until we have certainty from the judge that we are permitted to do so.
Can you talk about, I know it's right here in this paperwork, sorry. Here we go.
Mr. Cole is in the queue, if that's all right.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, does this read like an assassination to you?
I think it's important that I not characterize it. We are going to have a case that goes before a Philadelphia jury, and a Philadelphia jury is going to have to make a decision that is completely fair. I can tell you I find this very, very disturbing and very difficult to watch.
Is there any point after the fact that Mr. Mendoza knew that TJ was unarmed but still shot that third shot in his back during your investigation? Did he admit that he knew that TJ was unarmed?
So I think the best way to answer that is to say that there are a variety of factors in the evidence that make it pretty clear to me that Mendoza knew that TJ Siderio was unarmed before he shot him through the back. Those factors include the following. Number one, Mendoza's close proximity to Siderio at the time the officer fired the fatal shot. Number two, Mendoza's statement about the location of the gun to Officer Camacho less than a minute after Mendoza files the shot. Number three, Mendoza's decision and his actions when he runs straight up to Thomas Siderio, which strongly indicates he was not in fear that something was going to come of that. Even more so when he passes between two parked cars in close proximity. Number four, Mendoza's untruthful statement about his location when he fired his final two shots. When people make untruthful statements about what happened that are crucial to understanding the death of another person, in the law, that can be interpreted to indicate guilty knowledge, a sense that you need to cover something up because you know that what you did is illegal. And there is yet another factor, which is something that we intend to confirm, but there are indications that Mendoza calls out, drop the gun, before Thomas Siderio drops it. And then right after Thomas Siderio drops it, he calls out, get down. Now, why are we shifting from drop the gun to get down unless you saw the gun dropped? And by the way, after the cry was drop the gun was dropped. And after the cry was get down, he got down. Whether he got down because he tripped or whether he got down in a hurry and voluntarily is less clear on the evidence we had. But those are the factors that make this a considerable amount of evidence of actual knowledge that the child is unarmed.
And can you define close proximity? How far was Mr. Mendoza from TJ when he fired that third shot?
Brian?
It's approximately half a car length.
So that's about 4 feet, 5 feet.
What I can tell is it's about a half a car length. I don't know exactly how many feet.
Does he run up, stop, and shoot? Is that what happens? He
I-
runs up, stops, pauses, sees him, shoots.
Again, for that, I'd prefer to refer back to the video whenever it becomes available for people to actually view it.
Could you describe it, though, in how you've seen it in terms of the information you brought to the grand jury?
I'd rather not comment on it.
Larry, can you tell us what makes this, what we see in this presentment, what of it is first-degree murder?
All of it. I mean, there's very strong case law that when you point a firearm and fire it at a vital organ of the body, such as the upper back, the spine, or some other organ, that is sufficient evidence to establish the elements of first-degree murder. Having said that, we do consider this an ongoing investigation, and as you may have seen in some other cases, we are always going to consider what is brought to us and what new information we obtain. We take our responsibility to be even-handed and fair to police very, very seriously, and we are being very, very careful here. So we are delighted to get more information. If there is more information, we should know.
And can you address real quick the missteps, the apparent missteps of this entire setup? The undercover, the car, the lights when they go on, that they're not supposed to be conducting stops of this nature. Can you just touch on that real quick?
I'm going to touch on it, but I also want to turn that over to Brian. The presentment contains significant amount of information about it. There are reasons why police officers wear uniforms in certain situations and why they don't in other situations. There are reasons to have marked cars in certain situations and not to have them in other situations. And what we see here, as I said before, I think is, among other things, a real tragedy, because it would appear that this tinted, unmarked car containing police who were not in uniform, who are either visible simply as wearing a street shirt or visible as wearing street clothes with vests that have no designation of police on the front. This is the kind of encounter that could cause someone on the street to believe that the people who are pulling up are not police at all, to believe that the people who are pulling up in a climate that is obviously rife with gun violence are pulling up to do them harm and are not law enforcement at all. There are aspects of that investigation that remain ambiguous, but everything I just said to you about what was marked and what was not, and what was tinted and what was not, and what the actual clothing of these young male officers looked like when they were pulling up and when they jumped out of this vehicle, everything I just said to you, that is beyond dispute. And so it is very concerning. Brian, do you have another comment on that?
Sure. So I think the best way to summarize it is to say that the grand jury found that these 4 police officers were in plain clothes, they were in an unmarked car, that a directive applied, 12.8, that says that plainclothes, unmarked officers are not supposed to be making traffic stops like this, that when they made the decision when they first see the 2 juveniles, they don't decide to stop them at that point. The car actually goes around a city block, which contains a park. That's something that was in their findings. And then when that car comes back around, that's when they make the decision to actually make a stop. At that point, the lights don't go on. The earliest the lights appear to have gone on is at approximately the same time that the shot goes off. The timing is not clear based on the record. And that there were 4 officers involved in this who testified, and that there were some diverging accounts as to why the stop was made in the first place. 2 of them testified that they were stopping the juveniles because of their involvement in a stolen firearm investigation. 2 others said that was part of it, but also that they were making a traffic violation stop. So there was some divergence on that as well. So the grand jury noted some issues with the stop in their findings.
Traffic violation stop for riding the bikes the wrong way up the street, and that was it?
That's what was in the record, yes.
And have you talked to the police commissioner at all about this so far? Yeah.
For me, Kristen?
Yeah.
Yes, I've actually spoken to the commissioner this morning. I've spoken to her Wow, multiple times since Thursday. The Commissioner and I were actually in the same room watching this video together shortly after the incident occurred. We've been in very regular communication about it. And of course, as you may recall, the Commissioner made a decision to fire Officer Mendoza fairly early after the shooting.
And she had mentioned that there was credible threats against at least the, I mean, I think it was all 4 police officers, but the additional 3. Do you know that to be true, and are you investigating that aspect of it?
Do you have more specifics?
She had just said the reason that they did not put out the names of these officers was because there were credible threats against them.
I have no information of credible threats against these officers,
Okay.
nor has that been communicated to me by the Commissioner or anybody else.
The other question that I have is, you know, people, when they do these officer-involved shooting trainings, even the reality-based trainings, they oftentimes, believe me, I've done it, where they did something, or they think that somebody had a gun in their hand. Is that a plausible defense, a probable defense, thinking that maybe that he did have the gun in his hand, or did you mention that there is substantiated evidence that he did not have the gun in his hand, that Mendoza knew that he did not have the gun in his hand?
So, Ms. Johansson, I just went through a number of factors that, in my opinion, make it very clear that Mendoza knew that this child did not have a gun in his hand. There are certainly occasions when officers have good reason to believe that there could be a gun in the hand. They make an honest mistake, and under those circumstances, even though they've made a factual mistake, a shooting may be justified. There is nothing in the evidence in this case that supports that. The evidence in this case, as I mentioned earlier, is that the officer is in close proximity at the time the shot is fired, that the officer's statement about the location of the gun to Police Officer Camacho right after the shooting, actually, it's even more than a statement. He says where the gun is, and then he points to where the gun is, and then Camacho walks right over there, and yes, indeed, that's where the gun is. You know, the decision to run straight up in a way that shows that Mendoza was not in fear after the gun was dropped of being shot. And then, of course, you know, on untruthful statement from Mendoza about Mendoza's location at the time he fired his final 2 shots is potentially indicative of deception and of guilty knowledge. And as I also mentioned, although we continue to investigate it, there are some indications that the commands that Mendoza is issuing change from drop the gun is dropped, to get down. The young man gets down, and then after essentially complying with 2 consecutive commands, he's shot through the back and killed.
How many seconds was he on the ground?
Let me do this, if I may. Did that answer the question? Or, okay, all right, thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Approximately how many seconds was TJ on the ground before he was shot?
I mean, I could estimate, but once again, I'm going to ask Mr. Collins, who's probably seen the video 3 times as many times as I have. I'm going to ask him if he can help with that.
The best estimate I could give would be 4 to 6 seconds.
4 to 6.
4 to 6, yeah.
When you say you're still checking out this idea that he made commands of the 12-year-old, but you're still trying to confirm it, so that's not recorded, you've been told that?
There is audio and video that seems to indicate what I just said to you. As you might expect, audio and video are not always perfect. So, in my opinion, that is what was said, but we may go through some enhancement procedures to try to make sure that we are hearing it correctly, because we do, in fact, want to be as fair as we possibly can.
The other question I have is, are you guys doing an investigation to how both the 12-year-old and the 17-year-old or the 12-year-old had a gun at the time? Is that a different investigation?
I can tell you that we are indeed investigating related matters, including that matter, but I'm not prepared to talk further about that at this time.
There's a line in the presentment that says a Secret Service agent was involved at some point. Was he actually on the scene? Was he involved in any way?
I think it would be inappropriate for me to say why he was involved, and also unnecessary to this. My understanding was that he was not in a position to participate or to observe what happened. He was in the general area, but he was not in a position to participate or observe anything that happened from the time the first shot was fired until the time the last shot was fired. Let me check that, though, if I may. Brian, is that correct?
Right, that's correct. The information presented in the presentments indicates that he was part of the surveillance, but not on scene at the time of the actual the stop and the discharge.
Kind of related, but just so procedurally, why would the Secret Service be involved in something like that? I'm saying like in this specific case, is that typical and normal?
So I don't think it's appropriate for us to comment on it.
I just, even for background, or like for our understanding that that's not unusual.
I mean, agents, different, right, go ahead.
We are not actually trying to play cat and mouse. We are just trying to abide by the kind of information flow that is appropriate. It is not at all uncommon for there to be joint efforts of many different types that include both federal and local law enforcement. That much I can say.
Secret Service agent testified in the grand jury?
We are not going to comment on that at this time.
You see, when you look at a case like this, I mean, and you report here, the grand jury reports here, the 12-year-old shot at the car. So they came under fire. What role does that play in Mendoza's behavior in any way, do you think?
So all indications are that the 12-year-old fired the gun at the car. And obviously that plays a very significant role in explaining what happens. The initial bailout of the officers, some of the early shots that are fired in a sort of a chaotic manner, shots that are fired before the gun is dropped. All of that plays a role. And it is part of the story, and we have included it in this presentment because it needs to be considered. But the presentment also lays out how much time passes, what the events are that occur after that 12-year-old, 111-pound child does that. And ultimately, we cannot get around the reality that you have an unarmed 12-year-old who drops a gun 40 feet behind where he is shot to death. At the time he is shot to death, he is essentially on the ground. He's no longer trying to get away. It simply does not end it. The analysis is really the same sort of analysis that applies in many different homicide cases.
Can you help just clarify sort of the timeline of everything? So these officers were conducting some type of undercover operation, and they saw NK, juvenile NK, TJ, riding their bikes, and they followed them or went the other direction, initiated a traffic stop. Did they turn their lights on, identify that they're police officers, and then there was a shot fired then? Because I'm having a hard time with the timeline.
Sure, I understand.
Everything happened.
All right, so let me try to give a brief summary of it, and then Brian will come up and correct it, because he's the one who knows this even better than I. But essentially what is going on is that you have officers out of uniform in an unmarked vehicle. This is in the evening. They are doing various things to surveil the area, looking for some people. They're not looking for the 12-year-old at all. They come around. They are visible and apparently seen by these kids in the sense that a black vehicle with tinted windows that does not appear to be a police vehicle comes around, slows down, looks at them, goes back around the block, returns. And when it returns, it once again doesn't do what a normal car would do, meaning stop at a stoplight or stop at a stop sign. It's pulling up, essentially pulling up to them in the middle of a block. When that happens, there is every indication that the 12-year-old fires the gun into the vehicle. It is unclear exactly when the lights go on, but it appears to be almost simultaneous, as the presentment indicates. And presentment is, once again, it's very clear about what we know for sure, and it's also clear about the things we're not as certain about. But it appears that more or less simultaneously, the shot is fired and the lights go on. at which point the two boys flee and everything develops from there. Does that help?
Yeah, that helped everything, because I was trying to understand when the officers presented that they were officers, obviously, when the lights came on, but that was maybe after a shot was fired.
Well, yeah, or maybe while the trigger was being pulled, or maybe, you know, I mean, this is a situation, as I said, it certainly is tragic at many different levels, but it's a situation where the outcome might have been different with a marked police car, with lights and sirens that were activated 30 seconds earlier. You might have had a very different situation than what occurred, and that's why it is worth spending a little time looking at the process, the methodology that was followed in this instance. Are there any other questions? We need to finish up.
You don't make policy, obviously, for the police department, but in your discussions and meetings and looking at the videotape with Outlaw, have you suggested to her that these sorts of units, now they're all chasing guns, which is a huge problem here, that these units need to be revised in some way, that they can't act in this way? Have you recommended that to her?
You know, I am, anytime the commissioner wants my opinion, I'm more than happy to provide it, but I think the commissioner is well aware of the details here and is very capable on her own of figuring out any modifications of policy or modification. You know, policy is not always followed. She may also be aware of training that could be utilized. I don't want to speak for her. I think she speaks very well for herself, but I also think she's certainly aware of the specifics of what occurred here and the implications in terms of policy and training. All right, one last question and then I got to go. All right.
Was there any gun residue found on TJ's hand during the autopsy or anything like that? Because...
Give me 1 second. I'm going to see if I can answer that question. So that is as much as we would like to answer that question at this time. That's not a question that we're in a position to answer today. It probably is a question that we will be able to answer later upon taking a couple steps with the supervising judge. All right, thank you all very much.